The first thing Kale felt was the weight of the dirt pressing down on his chest. Not the betrayal, not yet, just the physical reality of the earth piling on top of him, layer by layer, slow and deliberate, like someone who had been planning this for a very long time and saw no reason to rush now that it was finally happening. He was buried to his waist before he was fully conscious. The sedative was still working through his blood, making his arms move wrong, making his body feel like it belonged to someone else, and the earth was coming down faster than his half-working hands could push it away. He could see the sky above him, a narrow rectangle of pale gray evening sky, and at the edge of that rectangle, looking down at him with a shovel in his hands, was his older brother Dorian. Dorian wasn't angry. That was the thing that would stay with Kale longer than anything else about that evening. His brother wasn't angry, wasn't guilty, wasn't even particularly sad. He looked the way a man looks when he has finally finished a task he has been putting off for too long. Relieved. Settled. Done. He told Kale, in a voice so calm it barely carried down into the pit, that this wasn't about hatred. That Kale had simply taken up too much space for too long, and that a man couldn't spend his entire life standing in his younger brother's shadow watching everyone forget his name. He said it the way you explain a practical decision. Then he picked up the shovel again. Kale fought. He fought with everything the sedative left him, which wasn't much, and the earth came down faster than he could clear it, and his screams went nowhere because Dorian had chosen the location well, far enough from the estate that sound didn't carry, close enough to the boundary wards that no hunter distress signal would get through the interference. Dorian had thought of everything. The last thing Kale saw before the dirt covered his face was that narrow strip of pale gray sky, and the first faint star of the evening appearing at its eastern edge, and his very last conscious thought before the darkness took him wasn't rage or grief or the desperate animal panic of someone being buried alive. His last thought was much colder than any of those things. He thought, I should have been paying more attention. Before all of this, Kale Donvale had been the most decorated hunter on the continent for 7 years running. He had cleared the Tower of Ashen Gods alone at 19, a feat that no other living hunter had come close to replicating, without armor, without backup, and without telling anyone he was going. He had simply walked in one evening and walked out the next morning carrying the crest of the first god, a relic so ancient the scholars couldn't date it, and he had placed it in his father's hands without ceremony and gone to bed like it was nothing. His father had wept. The continent had celebrated for a week. The Hunter Association had offered him a seat on the Continental Advisory Council, his own division, a title, a salary that would have set 3 generations of his family for life. Kale had declined everything except the base rank and gone back to work. His older brother Dorian had watched all of it from exactly one step behind and slightly to the left, wearing a smile that never once reached his eyes. Dorian was 3 years older and had never cleared a tower above Tier 4. He was skilled at the parts of their world that Kale was indifferent to, politics, networking, the careful cultivation of relationships with people who mattered. And for a long time he had told himself that those skills were valuable, that he was contributing something, that standing beside a legend was still a kind of standing. For a long time he had almost believed it. Then he stopped believing it. And somewhere in the years that followed he had started digging a different kind of plan. Slowly, carefully, the way you build something you intend to last. He had spent 3 years identifying every variable. The boundary ward interference in the eastern forest. The annual winter assembly that took their father to the capital. The specific combination of herbs that, dissolved in tea, produced a sedative deep enough to keep a hunter-ranked body compliant for 4 hours. He had tested each piece separately and confirmed each one before moving to the next. By the time Kale drank the tea, the pit had already been waiting for 2 weeks. The darkness after death wasn't empty. That was the first thing wrong with it, the first indication that what was happening to Kale was not what was supposed to happen. The darkness breathed. To move. It had weight and texture and the slow, enormous patience of something that had been waiting for a specific thing for a very long time. When Kale opened his eyes he was standing in a space with no floor and no ceiling and no walls, and in the center of it sat a man so ancient that the word ancient didn't really cover it. Ancient the way mountains are ancient, the way deep ocean trenches are ancient, the kind of old that suggests it was never young. His robes had no color any language had a name for. His eyes, when he opened them, were deep cosmic black with no iris or pupil, just depth. In his lap rested the crest of the first god, the same relic Kale had pulled from the tower 7 years ago and handed to his father without wanting anything for it. The ancient being studied Kale for a long time without speaking. Then he said that in 1,000 years of watching people arrive in this place, Kale was the first one who had looked at him like a problem to be worked around rather than a god to beg. He said he found that he appreciated it more than he expected to. He explained, without particular ceremony, that the crest had been waiting for someone to retrieve it without wanting anything in return, and that Kale had been the first person in a millennium to do exactly that. He said the crest chose its bearer, not the other way around, and that it had made its choice 7 years ago the moment Kale handed it away. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to complete the transfer. Then he held it out. Kale asked what it cost. The ancient being told him to go back and figure that out himself. The relic dissolved into streams of golden light that flowed directly into Kale's chest, not warmth but enormity, the feeling of a door opening inside him that led to a room so large he couldn't see the other walls. And then the void collapsed and there was only cold stone and the smell of earth and the distant sound of the world above him continuing without him. He opened his hands. The dirt moved. Not because he pushed it, because he told it to, in a language he hadn't known 3 minutes ago and now understood the way you understand your own name. The earth above him parted like water, and Kale sat up in his own grave in the eastern forest and breathed the night air and looked at his hands for a long time. He stood up out of the pit without using his legs. He brushed the dirt from his clothes with a thought. He looked at the distant estate windows warm with light and found that he could see through the walls without trying, could see his brother sitting at his desk in Kale's study, reading Kale's files, wearing Kale's family seal on his right hand, already writing correspondence under Kale's name. He watched Dorian for a long moment and felt nothing he had expected to feel. No rage. No grief. No urgency. What he felt was the cold, structural calm of a man who has just realized he has more time than he thought and intends to use every second of it correctly. He turned away from the estate and walked toward the city. 3 days after his death, Kale rented a room on the lower east side of Ardenvale under a false name, paid in coin he created from nothing without breaking stride, and spent his first evening sitting at a small table by the window thinking through the shape of what needed to happen. The official story was already written. The Hunter Association had filed a training accident report the morning after Kale disappeared, and by the time his father returned from the capital the paperwork was complete. The mourning period was announced, and Dorian had been formally recognized as acting head of the Ardenvale Hunter House, a title that came with a seat on the Continental Advisory Council, 3 high-tier tower contracts, and an invitation to the governor's spring gala. The machine had processed his death and moved on in 72 hours. Kale read the association report through the wall of the building it was stored in, from half a mile away, without any medium at all. He noted every name that had signed it. He noted every name that had attended the mourning ceremony. He cross-referenced both lists against every person who had asked questions about the report's inconsistencies versus every person who had accepted the story because it was convenient. The list of people who had accepted it too quickly was longer than he expected. On the second day, he found a filing clerk at the association's lower records office, a 17-year-old named Ren who had been sitting on something dangerous and hadn't slept in 2 nights because of it. Ren had found 3 impossible discrepancies in the original intake form, had circled them in pencil, then uncircled them, then circled them again, and had finally hidden the form behind a loose stone in the records room wall because he didn't know what else to do with it. Kale sat across from him at a street food stall and ordered 2 bowls of noodles and told him, without any particular drama, that he didn't need to do anything yet, just hold on to what he had found and remember it exactly. He told Ren that one day there would be a moment when one person with one piece of clear evidence would be the only thing that mattered, and that he thought Ren might be that person. Ren asked who he was. Kale said he was someone with a reason to care about the discrepancies, finished his noodles, and left. He did not look back, and he didn't need to. He could feel the exact moment the boy made his decision, and the decision was the right one. On the other side of the city, Dorian Ardenvale was having the best month of his life. He stood in front of mirrors in rooms he had claimed, with a title he had taken, surrounded by people who addressed him with the kind of deference that had always gone to his younger brother and now, finally, came to him. He attended meetings at the council and made decisions that affected real things and watched senior hunters defer to his judgment, and for the first time in his adult life he felt like a person who existed in full rather than a person who existed in someone else's margin. The only problem was the feeling that had started on the second day and refused to leave. It wasn't something he could locate or report. It wasn't a sound or a presence he could point to. It was the persistent, background certainty that the space behind him was occupied, that something patient and very aware was positioned just outside his peripheral vision at all times, watching him with the specific attention of something that already knew how everything was going to end and was simply waiting for the correct sequence of events to play out. He told himself it was guilt. Guilt was manageable. He had read enough about it to know it faded. Then one of his bribed guards came to him gray-faced and told him that the pit in the eastern forest was empty, and that the dirt had been pushed outward from the inside, and that it was arranged in a perfect circle around the edges of the hole. Dorian sent the guard out and sat alone in the study and looked at the wall for a long time. He sent investigators. They came back with nothing, not the frustrated nothing of people who looked hard and found nothing, but the specific nothing of people who had stopped looking because they had become convinced, separately and without consulting each other, that they would prefer not to continue. 2 of them resigned from his service the following week without explanation. Dorian poured himself a drink and did not touch it. The first letter arrived at the Continental Record 6 weeks after Cale's death. The record was older than the Hunter Association and answered to no single house or political body, which was precisely why the letter went there and not somewhere easier to influence. It contained a copy of the original intake form with the 3 discrepancies highlighted and a detailed technical analysis of why each one was physically impossible given the evidence available at the site. The letter was unsigned. The analysis was meticulous. The senior archivist who received it read it 3 times, locked it in her personal strongbox, and sent a quiet inquiry to 2 colleagues she trusted. The inquiry became a meeting. The meeting became a file. 1 week later, a retired field inspector named Caro, a woman who had investigated Hunter deaths for 30 years and had never once accepted a bribe or let a case go after she'd opened it, received an anonymous package containing handwritten testimonies from 3 estate servants who had been paid to leave for the evening of Cale's disappearance. The statements were specific and consistent and had the unmistakable texture of ordinary people describing ordinary things they had actually seen. Caro read them once. Then she contacted the Record. Dorian heard about the Record inquiry and Caro's involvement within 40 minutes of each other through separate channels, and he sat in the study and felt the architecture of the life he had built developing cracks in places he had been certain were solid. He sent people to find the source of the letters. They reported back that the inquiries seemed to dissolve on contact, that whoever was moving through the city's information networks left no trace of the kind that people normally leave, and that several of his best contacts had developed the same uneasy sense of being watched from somewhere they couldn't identify and had decided, individually, that they would rather not continue. He reached for the communication crystal on his desk and stopped with his hand hovering over it. He put it away. Outside, somewhere in the city below, something was moving through the streets with purpose and without hurry, and both of those things together were significantly more frightening than either one alone. In the estate garden 3 days before the gala, Cale sat beside his father on the stone bench under the old tree where they had sat together 100 times when Cale was young. His father had come back from the capital to find one son running the household and the other one dead, and the grief had hollowed him out in the specific way grief hollows people who have never fully understood how much they loved something until it was gone. He was smaller than Cale remembered, older in a way that had nothing to do with time. When he saw Cale sit down beside him, he went completely still. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask what had happened, or where Cale had been, or what any of it meant. He was an intelligent man, and the fact of his younger son sitting alive on the bench was a single piece of evidence from which the rest could be reconstructed without anyone spelling it out. They sat together for a long time without speaking. Then his father reached out and gripped his arm, not aggressively, just the grip of someone who needed something to be real, and Cale let him hold on for a moment before he told him to be at the gala. That he should be there, and that he should watch, and that after it was over there would be time to talk about everything else. He stood up and left his father sitting in the garden in the gathering dark, looking at the space where his younger son had been. The governor's spring gala was held at the estate on the northern hill, in a hall that held 400 people and had filled to 382 that evening, and Dorian Ardenvale stood at the center of all of it and was, by any observable measure, exactly where he had always wanted to be. He was good at this. Cale, watching from the edge of the room in clothes that made him invisible to the room's social attention, could acknowledge that honestly, his brother had the warmth, the calibrated eye contact, the memory for names and previous conversations, the ability to make each person feel specifically seen. These were skills Cale had never developed because he had never needed them, and watching Dorian deploy them with genuine ease, he could admit that his brother had built something real here, even if he had built it on a foundation that didn't belong to him. He had been in the room for 40 minutes before Dorian saw him. The moment it happened was visible from across the hall. A half-second pause in the middle of a sentence, a blink that lasted a fraction too long, and then the immediate practiced recovery of someone who had been waiting at some level for exactly this moment even while hoping it would never come. Dorian finished the sentence, laughed at something, touched the arm of the person he was talking to, and excused himself with perfect grace. They met in a narrow side corridor between the main hall and the kitchen, with the muffled sound of 400 people celebrating leaking through the walls on both sides. Dorian looked at his younger brother and asked how he was alive. Cale told him it didn't matter. Dorian asked what he wanted. Cale told him he didn't want anything from him specifically, that he hadn't touched him, hadn't gone to the association, hadn't filed anything or contacted anyone or made any move against him directly. He told him there was a file at the Continental Record containing 3 independent witness testimonies, the original intake form with full analysis, documented financial transfers to the bribed guards, and a retired field inspector who had been building cases for 30 years and had never once let one go. He told Dorian that he hadn't built the file. He had simply made sure that the people who were already troubled by the inconsistencies had a way to find each other. He told Dorian that the record was publishing their findings in the morning, that the association would receive a formal inquiry by noon, that the governor was going to be presented with the complete file at some point in the next 20 minutes, given where the senior archivist was currently standing in the main hall. Then he told him the truth about why. He said he could have killed him. He said that after everything, the simplest version of this was available to him and he had chosen not to take it, not because of mercy, and not because of any feeling he had about his brother as a person, but because killing him would have been private. And what Dorian had done was not a private thing. Dorian had taken his name and his title and his life and had worn them in front of the whole continent, and what was going to happen in that hall in the next few minutes was the only response that matched the scale of what had been done. He stepped back. He walked back through the corridor door into the gala. He did not watch it happen dramatically. There was no single moment of collapse, no confrontation in the center of the hall. It was quieter and more total than that. The senior archivist found the governor's aide near the eastern corner of the hall and delivered the sealed envelope, and the aide's face changed as he read the cover, and within 10 minutes the governor had excused himself from his current conversation and was reading the contents of the Continental Record's formal inquiry notice in a private anteroom with 2 officials. The information moved through the room the way cold moves through a space, gradually, without announcement, changing the temperature everywhere it reached. People near Dorian began to find reasons to be somewhere else. Not dramatically, just the small social recalibration of a crowd that has sensed something and is adjusting accordingly. Conversations that had been warm became brief. People who had been seeking his attention began to notice other things that required it. The circle of easy social connection that had surrounded him all evening thinned by degrees until he was standing in a space that was technically full of people and functionally alone. A minor official approached him and spoke quietly near his ear, and whatever was said made Dorian's grip on his wine glass tighten until a hairline crack appeared in the stem. He set the glass down on a passing tray with the careful control of someone managing themselves in public, and he stood in the center of what had been his evening and looked at the room that had already stopped being his, and his face did something it had not done all night. It stopped performing. Cale was on the terrace when this happened, standing at the stone railing with both hands resting open on the cool stone, looking out at the city spread below him. It was the same pale gray evening sky he had last seen from the bottom of a pit. The same early evening light. The same first star appearing at the eastern edge of the horizon, in exactly the same position, as if no time had passed at all, as if the only thing that had changed was the altitude from which he was looking at it. Behind him, through the terrace door, he could hear the gala ending. Not collapsing, just ending, the way things end when the reason for them has dissolved. The music stopping. The clusters of conversation breaking apart. The sound of a room deciding it was time to be somewhere else. He stayed at the railing until the hall behind him was quiet. He had spent his entire life being extraordinary in ways he had never asked to be, and handing things away without wanting credit, and making himself smaller so the space around him felt more comfortable to people who were not as capable as he was, and he had done all of it without examining it because he had never had a reason to look at it directly. The pit had given him that reason. He lifted his hands from the railing. He turned away from the terrace and walked down the stone steps toward the city below, and as he reached the streets and moved into the warm amber light of the lanterns, he felt the shape of everything that was ahead of him, not the revenge, which was finished, but everything else, the towers he hadn't cleared and the things he hadn't tried and the version of his life that had been waiting behind all the years he had spent making himself easy to overlook. He walked into the city without hurrying and without looking back. The pit was empty and the sky was the same sky, and he had 5 years of himself left to figure out what to do with a god's power and no interest in being anyone's shadow ever again.